2025 is going to be a great year to learn how to use the Fusion page in DaVinci Resolve. And today I want to show off a sort of exercise that I highly recommend. I've talked about several times on this channel before, but it's something that was super valuable to me when I started really diving into Fusion. And it's something I try to bring up regularly. And this kind of exercise really helps you develop the tools to understand Fusion on a deeper level. We're going to start here in Resolve. We've got an open timeline. I'm going to drag an empty Fusion composition onto my timeline and then click this button to open the Fusion page. And what we're going to look at is we are going to break apart an included free template that's in the Fusion page. And lots of people don't even know that all these templates are here. But if you open up Effects, Templates, under Edit will be all of the effects and titles and generators and stuff that you have access to on the Edit page. But if you open up Fusion, there's a whole host of presets and templates that come with Fusion for the purpose. I mean, you can use them in projects, but also just for the purpose of learning. The one we're going to look at today is under Motion Graphics, and it's this Radar 2 effect. I'll drop that on a timeline. And if I preview this last node, it'll work its way up, give it some space to think. And we have this really nifty radar effect where we have this grid, we have the sweeping bar, we have particles coming in, and as soon as the particles pass a certain line, they change color, and the sweeping bar, when it passes over the particles, they glow. It's very cool. There's a number of interesting things going on here, and we're going to talk about them by breaking down and not quite reverse engineering, because we're not going to be like duplicating this from scratch, but we're just going to walk through the node tree, and hopefully you'll see the process of how you can walk through any node tree to learn how individual nodes work or how they work together. Some really cool stuff. That's what we're going to do. Let's get started. Now we are ending at this last node here, and I can plug that back into my media out so that if I were to go back to the edit page, you would see this radar effect. But when you are going through this process of kind of breaking down a node tree, you can sort of like backtrack to get to like a decent starting point, right? So we have this brightness and contrast node, and then we get to our first merge node. And merge nodes, super important. They're some of like the foundational tools of building complicated effects. And on a standard merge node, you have this yellow background input and this green foreground input. Lots of times when I'm building an effect, I will have like the very background node close to the beginning of my node tree, but you can introduce new elements at any time and have your merge, work with these inputs in either way to tell it what to put on top. A quick keyboard shortcut, if you press Control T, that will swap which one is on top. And if I look at what happened, you can see what this is adding on top. Once I change those foreground and background, you can see that the grid almost went away because that grid, you can tell, was in the foreground layer, and you can preview these. So in the background, I had just this blurred out green blob, and then in the foreground, I had everything else going on, including that grid, including the dots, and that merged over this way. But if I change those inputs, then all of a sudden that grid is underneath that green sort of background, and you can't see it at all. If you're trying to connect things up and you like accidentally connect them to the wrong inputs, instead of like disconnecting them and try to reconnecting them, Control T can get you back sorted out. Now, most of the time I would recommend, tracing back on these background elements, but we already know what's in the background. So let's see what is plugged into that. We have this grid and all these dots. If we go back one more, we have just that grid, back one more, just that grid without the bar. And then we can look at what is coming into this. And let's just go all the way back. And we start with a simple background node. Here we've got this teal value. And by the way, over on image, this has been set to a custom resolution, and that is being maintained all the way to the end of this effect. But we are starting with just a plain teal square. And then what do we do with that? We plug it into this brightness and contrast node, just make it a little darker, plug it into another brightness and contrast node, and all of a sudden we've got this little cross. What's going on? Well, that brightness and contrast node has these two masks connected and plugged into the mask input for that brightness and contrast node. I can preview those masks individually and you will see them stacked on top of each other. This is also mask data, right? So like where we were previewing this shape or even the next one, you see this checkerboard pattern, that means it's transparent. If you preview a mask, then you will only see a white and black, and if they are blurred, you'll see that little feathered edge. But when you are dealing with mask data, this black is an alpha value of 0. So when you are looking at masks, black means transparent, white means solid. And this is masking a brightness and contrast node, which all it is doing is it is enabling this alpha layer and it has pulled down the gain entirely. If I go back and disconnect this mask and then look at that brightness and contrast node, it like subtracts the entire image. But once I connect the mask, you see the lines there, and that is because over on settings, we are applying these masks inverted. You could always invert them on the masks themselves, but it's pretty simple to deal with the masks as is. And then once they are connected to this brightness and contrast node, this brightness and contrast node is pretty much at this point a subtract node. It is subtracting whatever is being told by the masks, and we are then inverting the mask so that you only see, so it subtracts everything else. So I guess at this point it's kind of like an addition only node. Now check this out. This super cool, right? So what, we've got a little cross, that's neat. We plug that into a transform node and all of a sudden, boom, we've got this entire grid. What's going on? Well, if you look, you'll see a tiny box down in the middle, and if I scroll in, you'll see, oh, that kind of looks like the original cross we had just a node earlier. Whoop, it is. But this transform, which gives us your standard like position, scale, rotation values, if I look at this, you can see the size is scaled down to almost nothing, right? It's a scale of 0.05. But you'll also notice that this has an edges parameter that has been changed to wrap. If I change this back to canvas, then you'll say, oh yeah, we just scaled that really small. But when this is set to wrap, it takes pixels from the other side of the image, and then when this side of the image scales down, it pulls pixels in from that. So because we have this general cross, when we scale down, it naturally repeats and gets us this really awesome grid. When I first saw this, it blew my mind. It's super cool. It's a super cool way of building out like a relatively complicated shape from, you know, just those two masks. Now, out of that, we come to a coordinate space node. And this takes our nice square grid and zoop, makes it a circle. Super cool. And that is just like the one function this node does. It has a drop down, whether you want to like change it back the other way. If you add in a sort of circular image, then you can go circular to polar, but we want polar to rectangular, which sort of warps it this way. And now we've got our little circular grid, and that is being plugged into one more final brightness and contrast node, which is doing sort of the same thing. The alpha layer is being brought down a little bit. You'll notice it doesn't completely subtract it, but this time the mask is not inverted. So we're just subtracting a little bit from the center, sort of just pulling this opacity down a little bit. And that of course is based off of this ellipse node coming into the mask input, and that is exactly where it is being pulled out a little bit. Very neat. And now we get to the sweeping bar. But if you'll remember, way back at the beginning, we still started with this teal square. But instead of putting that, or not instead, we put it over on this side to darken it down a bit, but then we also sort of split it off. And this is a giant power of working with nodes. Any one node output can split and go into, you know, many other nodes that you can then apply in different ways and then join back together. For instance, let me come down to just where this bar is. Because of this value, these colors are tied together. If I go to this first background node, go back to color, and pull down this green, pull up this red, then now we've got this little like pink sort of radar view instead of that, or yellow instead of that green. These colors are tied together because they are pulling their color from one node, even though it is generating different shapes with that same source color. Pretty nifty. This is what we wanted. But let's see what we're actually doing with this one node. We've got this square, and that is being plugged into a brightness and contrast node. Let's look at this. Alpha is enabled and gain is pulled all the way down. So again, we're sort of dealing with that subscription value. But again, this apply mask is inverted. So now we will only see this shape or this color where these masks are visible. So let's walk through these masks. We have one value, which is just sort of this edge. Next value is just that feathered edge. And then finally, if we look, we see just this brightest line in the middle. So we have this general feather. This time we are actually subtracting that edge with this next math and then adding back in that little bright line. So when we preview this brightness and contrast node, that's what we get. We have that thin line of just that full value, and then it fades out. Now that is being plugged into a transform. And if I preview this, we'll see something pretty interesting. Look at this. It is just wiping pretty consistently. And as soon as it gets to the edge, it starts over on the other side. And you'll notice the edges are set to wrap like before, but we're gonna have something pretty interesting going on with these keyframes. And you'll notice we have a keyframe at frame 0 and a keyframe at frame 50. And if we select this transform, open it up in our spline viewer, make sure that X value is enabled, you'll see some interesting things. These keyframes, it's a little dimmer, so hopefully you can see, but these keyframes are repeating. We've only set 2 keyframes, but something is telling the computer, okay, as soon as it reaches this final value, just jump back and then play the thing again. And the thing that is telling those keyframes to do that lives in the spline viewer. If I select those 2 keyframes, you'll notice this value is lit up, and that is a set loop parameter. If I uncheck that, then we'll play those 2 keyframes and then end. But if I select those and turn on the set loop, then as soon as it gets to the other keyframe, it just perfectly, flawlessly loops. This is super important to remember because something powerful like this does only live here in the spline viewer. You won't be able to find it over here in the inspector for your tools. But of course, after that, we have a coordinate space. And just like before, this is a square sort of thing. When we plug into coordinate space, instead of going from left to the right, now one of those, baseline coordinates is always stuck in the middle. So now this is perfectly sweeping around that exact motion we want. Instead of trying to scale this down and rotate it around, all you need to do, if you know how these nodes work, is have this perfectly looping sideways, and then coordinate space will translate that sideways motion into loop motion. Super cool. Now, here, this node branches again. One of them merges back over that grid, pretty neat, but one of them gets sent out to this bitmap node. And remember when we were looking at masks up here that were dealing in this black and white image to say what was transparent and what was solid? A bitmap node lets you take any input and you can tell it what parameters or what values to look at, and it will generate a mask node from that source. So we aren't dealing with actual mask data. We're dealing with an image at this point, but we plug that image into a bitmap node and we are looking at the alpha values and we sort of clamp it down here. You'll notice this is harsher than what we plugged into it. You can kind of see through it down here, but once you look at the bitmap, it's solid. And that is because we have really pulled down this highlight value. So it stays solid for a longer period of time and then also fades out. Now, what are we doing with this? Well, if we sneak ahead, you'll notice that we are looking at particles coming in at this point. And when this sweeping bar goes over our particles, you'll notice they extra brighten up, and then that effect fades out. So there's some fun stuff going on with this bitmap, but to fully understand it, let's look at the beginning of this next chain where we're dealing with particles. Now, the particle system in Fusion, super powerful, but it is sort of like a dedicated walled garden area, kind of like the shape system, kind of like the 3D system, where you can use nodes, make a bunch of stuff, but then you need to plug that into a p-render node, and that p-render node is actually the first node in that chain that you are allowed to preview. It used to be this way with the shape system, but they have since changed that. So you can preview earlier nodes before the S-render node. But with particles, it still works this way. You can only preview the p-render node. So it can be a little more complicated to go node by node and see how things are built. You've got to really explore the settings and figure out what each individual node does. But like a lot of particle effects, we start with a P emitter. which you can see, if you click, you can see where it is starting, and it is generating particles. If I go back to the beginning, it's going to generate 30 particles, and then 1 frame later, it sets those particles down to 0. So for only 1 frame, we're just creating a burst of 20 particles. It's cranked up this lifespan for well over 1,000, so these particles are going to last as long as we want them to, especially in like this default like 5-second demo. So we create these particles, and importantly, you can give them velocity or direction or other things based on these settings, but these have all been turned down to 0 because this next node is P point force, and kind of like spawning those particles. We have a strength of 2 down to 0 right on our first frame. So we are providing just a instant burst when these particles form to sort of pull them towards the center. You could play with these power if you want them to like pull faster or really faster, and then they'll be flying out the other way, or just set this back to its default of 1. But it spawns them and creates this force for that same single frame, which gives these a good amount of motion. But then we start getting to some really interesting things with this P change style node. Here you'll notice we have a different circle on the screen. And so we are spawning particles over here. Then we have this second circle for this P change style. And if we preview it, you can sort of see what happens. We have these green dots, and then based on that velocity, shortly after these green balls enter this line, they change from that green, which is determined by this P emitter, to this red, which is happening on this P change style. Now, something interesting is happening with this delay here going on, and part of that is driven by this next P friction node, which as soon as these particles enter this slightly larger circle, they are being hit by a little bit of friction to change their momentum. But even if I toggle off that friction, some of these points are being hit by this change style a little bit later. That's something I haven't quite been able to track down. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe this is just a quirk of how this region is handling this P change style. But with that friction, changing up these positions a little bit, that finally gets us to our P render node, which just lets us visualize all this information. So then we have these dots coming through. Once they hit a certain area, they turn red and they're coming towards our center. Then we finally get back to that bitmap we created, right? So now this bitmap is creating masked data for us to use somewhere else. So we have this P render node, and that is coming into a brightness and contrast node. We've only seen this being used on the subtract gain most of the time with this alpha layer on it. This alpha layer is not selected this time, so we are only dealing with color information, and the gain is cranked all the way up to 5. And as we sort of looked at before, now if you preview this, every once in a while, those dots will pulse out. They'll get a little bit brighter, and you'll look right after that is another soft glow node, which just like also pulses at the same time. You'll see something pretty interesting here. So these particles are being changed, driven off that bar, but we are only introducing the bar at this point as masked data. So that bar is influencing that wipe as it pulses over, but it's not until this later merge node that we actually bring that bar back in before, so we can see how perfectly that timing does sync up. And then after that, we have this merge before, which brings in that green background. And the last thing, which we kind of skipped over earlier, is one final brightness and contrast node with the alpha enabled pulled down and with a simple ellipse mask here, which should mean, boom, it perfectly sort of trims off that extra feathering and the extra grid. So now we are left with just this perfect circular style, this perfect radar layout with all that extra stuff going on. I haven't still touched a ton of particles work. I've done much more of sort of the rest of it, of MotionVFX type deal. But even though I've talked about this multiple times before, and even though I've done lots of other stuff in Fusion many, many times before, revisiting a preset like this is always super valuable, especially for, you know, if you don't touch certain areas. I haven't touched particles a lot. Now I've got some heading for a new area to explore new stuff in particles. Now, I know this can be overwhelming, especially if you're new in Fusion, but just sort of like going node by node and taking the time to see, what has changed in these individual nodes can be super, super useful. That's also the reason why on all my free plugins and presets and stuff, I leave them available for you to open up. Let me find something like one of my generators. Let's do my speed lines effect, right? I made like simple drag and drop anime speed lines. That's neat. If I click this effect in the inspector, I have this wand icon, open that up, and you can see we have a little group of that node. And if I open it up, wow, just like we did before, we can see I start with fast noise that gave me these lines. And look, we're even using that coordinate space to all of a sudden take these horizontal lines, take these vertical lines, and boom, make them stretch from the center. And then we just sort of like we did before, mask out that center area, but with that feathering, and boom, you've got anime speed lines. This skill set of breaking down effects is so, so useful. And I think one of the giant perks to working in a node-based system, especially learning in a node-based system. If you have ever tried to open up someone else's After Effects composition, or even like a plugin or a template that you bought, and figure out what's going on, if it doesn't have clear areas for like that tell you, hey, put your text here, or if you want to figure out how it works or deconstruct it or anything, it can be a mess. But in Fusion, going node by node, once you sort of get your footing, I think it's relatively accessible to break down larger effects and learn how they were made. So hopefully, if you followed along, or if you want to check out that radar effect that we looked at, like I said, under effects, templates, Fusion, motion graphics, radar 2, boom. If you have Resolve, you should have this effect loaded on there already. Open it up, poke around, grab some of my free presets, poke around those. Learn some new Fusion stuff. We'll probably be covering more basics soon, just getting started in the new year, fun stuff about Fusion. But especially if you're like a hands-on, self-taught kind of learner, this is how you get hands-on in Fusion. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.